How many people, I've been doing these DNA tests and talking about DNA testing as it relates to family history for about 15 years now. And it used to be when I first started doing this, I'd always ask how many people got a DNA test. And after a while, you do this so often. Now most people have, but I don't know, in this community, I've never been here before. How many people have gotten a DNA test for family history here? So not so many. Okay. So we should really go back to the beginning of what this all means, because there's probably a lot of people here that have a lot of questions about DNA and how it can be used for family history, right? I mean, that's why you're here, right? So let's talk about that a bit. I mean, I have, let's see if this progresses here. I'm not sure oh yeah, there it is, okay, I just got to give it a little time. Okay, the best way to think about DNA as it relates to family history is to think of, well, where does DNA come from? It's our inheritance, so to speak. So just like you inherit things from your family, maybe from your grandparents or your great-grandparents, you have a set of old letters, or you have a family Bible that gets passed down through the family, maybe even from an immigrant ancestor, maybe a family Bible gets passed down through, or a family farm, or perhaps furniture or something like that. We also get tradition, right? We get, even not just these artifacts, but we get traditions that get inherited down through our families, and we get our values inherited down through our families. Think of DNA like this. Think of DNA kind of like an artifact that comes from your family. It comes from someplace, coming from both of your parents combined within you. I have, my face looks much like my dad. As I get older, I look more and more like my dad. My dad's now deceased. But as I get older, my face looks much more like him. And if I look at pictures of my dad when he was young, he looks like I was when I was young. But my dad was 5'7", and I'm 6'1". I get my body type from my mom's dad. And we all are this unique combination. You would have the same stories. What do you look like in terms of your dad or your mom or your grandpa or your grandma? You all have these stories. These characteristics are actually in our DNA and get passed down through our families this way. So DNA is like this artifact that gets passed down through, even back from those generations that we don't remember anymore, even back from those generations that we don't have a paper trail to, back beyond these records of genealogy. And now it so happens that scientists have been able to figure out these chemical signatures within our DNA and are able to compare those to other people around the world. So this is a way that we can now enhance our genealogy, enhance our study of family history, and connect to people that we wouldn't otherwise have known to be our relatives. So if you think about this, DNA from about 2002 to the present time is when it began to be feasible to commercially test DNA for these kinds of projects. And at first it was quite expensive. But over time, it's gotten cheaper and cheaper. They've automated the testing. They've perfected and developed ways to test more cheaply and more efficiently. And so now tests are typically $99 or even sometimes on specials for $79. So it's a fairly inexpensive way that you can begin to look at and explore this kind of family history that you can do through DNA testing. So it's advanced significantly from the time that it's become commercially available, about 20 years ago. It's become more inexpensive. But with this, there's also a new concern. And I didn't hear this concern 15 years ago when people started testing. But now there's a new concern about privacy and how is this information used? What's it going to be used for? And that kind of thing. And this comes about now because there's more of a concern about privacy everywhere. There's concern about our cell phones and data getting mined in all kinds of aspects of our lives that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago. It's a concern because information gathering has become very easy and accessible on everything, right? So DNA then just becomes another piece of this. I want to address those concerns. Certainly nobody should be pressured to ever get a DNA test. It has to come out of your own interest in your own family history if you want to pursue something like that. But there are things that you can do to make your test more or less private or more or less accessible depending on what your own personal concerns are with that. So I'm going to address some of that during this presentation and some of the other questions. I've been doing this for a while, so I kind of know the questions, for the most part, that people ask during these presentations, and I try to address them in the presentation itself. But we will get some time for questions at the end as well. So let's look at the reasons people get DNA tests. You could get a DNA test for a medical reason. Certainly there's lots of genetic diseases or genetic anomalies or genetic predispositions for certain things that a medical DNA test would be worthwhile getting. That's not what we're talking about here. Typically, the markers that are used in testing for family history are not markers that they use in medical testing and such. So that's a whole different realm than what I'll be talking about. I'm not an expert in medical testing for medical testing for DNA in any sense whatsoever, but that is one reason that people get tested. Another reason is for identity's sake, and what I mean by that is in legal terms, sometimes in criminal cases and that type of thing, they're using DNA these days to identify a person. I'm not really talking about that so much either, although there is a bit of a correlation between that and DNA for family history that I'll get to. But this is another reason that people would perhaps get DNA tested for an identity, perhaps for a paternity test and things like that. You test DNA to determine whether somebody's the father of a certain child and such. Another reason to test is archaeological or historical reasons. And this is kind of where a lot of the forefront is in DNA testing. You can now test Egyptian mummies or the people that were buried in the peat bogs in Ireland and in England and test their DNA and see what that DNA was like thousands of years ago compared to people alive today. It's kind of an interesting dynamic going on with that kind of testing too, but it's not exactly what we're talking about here today. We're going to talk about DNA as it relates to genealogy and family history. Now, to some extent, maybe there's a continuum, and there is a continuum between that historical or archaeological testing of DNA and testing people alive today and maybe tracing their families back 400, 500, 600 years, something like that. There is a continuum. But we won't get into the archaeological piece. We'll get into more of the family history piece here today. So the genealogical or the family history research piece is what we're going to be looking at. Now, just yesterday, as I was preparing, I gave a different, almost the same presentation at the Swiss Anabaptist Genealogical Association in Morgantown, PA, yesterday before I headed up here last night. And yesterday morning, I was just looking through some news items, and this one popped up. So I put it right in the presentation. So this is as fresh as can be from this weekend. This is an article posted on CNN. A mom found a jawbone in her son's rock collection, and then 22 years later, genealogy researchers have ID'd the remains, and the remains are from a U.S. Marine. This is exactly that identity piece that I was talking about earlier. So if you read through this article, the collection came from this man's grandfather, And they knew there was a human jawbone in here. It was identified as a human jawbone. But back at that time, 22 years ago, there was not a way to test and identify who this was. They reported it to the police and such. So there was maybe a small investigation, but nobody knew exactly what this human remain bone, where it came from or anything at that time. But now there are databases available, and you've read about other ones in terms of criminal cases and such. There are databases available that we can, and the way to extract the DNA has become cheap enough and foolproof enough that they can take that bone, they can extract the DNA from that bone, they can then compare the DNA from that bone to publicly available databases. They can find out, well, with the Y chromosomal DNA, well, what surname does that DNA from that bone match to in those databases? And then based on that, they can find out the identification of the person. And that's exactly what happened here. And that's exactly maybe where some of the issues come in about privacy, right? This could not have happened this way even 10 years ago. But now, because those databases are available as they are, more and more people test, more and more people have those test results in those databases, and so then you can compare even better than ever as new DNA gets compared to those databases, finding the identification of people. So is DNA testing for me? Is DNA testing for you? The questions would be, ask yourself, are you interested in family history and the connections that DNA can reveal through being tested? If that's an interest for you, then you've made the first step. If it's not an interest for you, then don't get tested. But if it is, that's the first step. Are you okay then with connecting with other people that match your DNA? Because what's going to happen, you could get your DNA tested and keep it all to yourself, but then you're not going to be able to see if you match other people. You really have to open up your test to other people, seeing if they match you, so then you can get information if you match other people. And this is really a valuable thing, because you can determine third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, people that you didn't necessarily know that you were related to, that you are actually related to through your DNA. And then it becomes an interesting way of discovery, because you can contact those people and see, well, how are we related? Where do we have a common ancestor? Is it a great-great-grandparent someplace? And which one is it, if it is that way? So it becomes an interesting way that you can connect to people, but you have to provide your DNA into those databases to make that happen. And then, of course, this is not just a once-and-done type of thing, typically. It's a journey of exploration. There are different types of DNA tests. There are different levels of how much you can test, and of course, how much time you spend in kind of developing your genealogy based on DNA and contacting other people is really, really up to you. But it's a journey that you take after you get tested. Some people get tested and it's once and done and that's it. But some people get more absorbed into, well, this is really interesting for me and I want to expand and explore this further and further. So DNA testing can reveal new facts about our ancestors not known through traditional ways. Traditional ways, I mean by the paper trail, like looking at cemetery records or Bible records or census records and things like that, where your families are listed out in different ways. DNA is a way that you can expand beyond that by looking at these artifacts in our bodies that come from our ancestors, right? This is what we're talking about. However, gathering that comparative information about your DNA requires that you also likewise share your information with others. We have three types of DNA. The autosomal DNA comes from the nucleus of the cell, and it comes from both sets of parents. So both your parents, all your grandparents, your great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, back multiple generations. That's called autosomal DNA. It gets combined My sister and I, we have exactly the same ancestors, right? We don't have exactly the same DNA. That's because it gets combined in different ways, and I'll get some DNA from dad that my sister doesn't get from dad, and I get some from mom that my sister doesn't get from mom, and vice versa, even though we have the same ancestors. There's also mitochondrial DNA that comes from the mother's side. So that'd be and it comes to sons and daughters of a mother. So males and females have mitochondrial DNA, but it always comes from the mother. And it always comes from the mother's mother, and the mother's mother's mother, and all the way back maternally. So if you talk about mitochondrial DNA, it's not your mother's maiden name, because that's your mother's father's name. It's your mother's 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 mother. I'm a Martin. My mom is a Nault, and her mom was a Landis. You have that family around here some too, right? And her mom was a Bradley, which is an Irish family, and her mom was Book, and her mom was Buffemeyer, and Coldren, and Lebo, and Herzl, and I'm about back as far as I can go. Mitochondrial DNA does not hold to a surname. And this is why it's tricky with genealogy, because every one of those surnames that I mentioned is, yes, the maternal line, but then the father. The mitochondrial DNA comes from the mother's family. It does not connect to a surname, so it's a little tricky for genealogy because we rely so heavily on surnames in genealogy. But that's an interesting place if you want to explore that maternal line. Just keep in mind it's the maternal line all the way back. The Y DNA is the most interesting for genealogy because the Y DNA corresponds to a surname. And so I have a project set up through the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, which is now called Mennonite Life, that is predominantly focused on Y DNA. There's also a mitochondrial DNA portion of that project. But the Y DNA becomes the most important as it relates to genealogy because the surnames are connected to it. So there are Y DNA signatures for particular surnames. Surnames follow the paternal lineage, so my cousins that share my same surname will have the same Y DNA. My cousins who are my dad's sisters' families or my mom's sisters' or brothers' families do not share the same surname as me. They have different Y DNA. The males in those families have different Y DNA, DNA that corresponds to their surnames. So there's a Martin DNA signature, but then on my mom's side, there would be a Nault DNA signature, and then on my mom's side, there would be a Landis DNA signature. But my mom doesn't have that Y DNA. It'd be her father that does, or her brother, or her brother's sons, not her sister's sons. It has to be paternal all the way back to get the Y DNA for that particular family. That becomes the most interesting in family history research. So unfortunately, for you ladies, if you're interested in your maiden name in terms of Y DNA, you have to have somebody close to your family with that surname that's male and have them tested to find the Y DNA signature of that family. So keep that in mind. You can also do some of this with autosomal DNA, but the Y DNA signature becomes really important for tracing families based on surnames. Now, I want to go back a little bit to this idea of, is our DNA private? And these concerns are very legitimate, like I've mentioned, and your motivation, if you're going to do a DNA test and such, will come out of your interest in genealogy. But I'm going to say our DNA is not private, and this is the reason why. Where does our DNA come from? Well, there are reasons why not, right? There are reasons why it's not private. Where does our DNA come from? It comes from our ancestors, right? We've already talked about this. It's an artifact that comes down through our family. So your DNA is really similar to a brother or a sister. you have the exact same ancestors. Your DNA is really similar. So is your DNA exactly your own? Now, legally, yeah, it is, but nature doesn't necessarily work that way because DNA comes from someplace. So your brothers and sisters have DNA really similar to you. And your cousins do too, because your cousins and you share one set of grandparents. And then a little bit less, if we extend it out further, your second cousins do, and your third cousins, and your fourth cousins. This type of similarity is like a continuum, that the closest relatives in your family have the most similar DNA to you, and as you extend out to more and more distant relatives, there's a little bit less similarity in that DNA. But because that DNA is like that and a continuum, it's also traceable. So you can say, and this is why your DNA is not private. You can say, oh, I'm never going to get tested. My DNA is private to me. And you can legally say that and do that. But your brother or sister can also legally say and do, well, I am going to get tested, or your cousin, or your second cousin, or your third cousin. And if that person gets tested, and let's say there's a criminal case, they will find you, not because you tested, they will find you because your cousin tested, or your second cousin tested. Or if it's about Y DNA, it could be your fourth cousin or your fifth cousin, back pretty far. Your DNA is not really as private as we tend to like to think that it is. And it's just because of the way that nature works, the way that families work, that our DNA is actually a continuum of similarity, most similar to the people that are closest to us in our family, and then less similar as we get further and further away. So this chart just shows where that autosomal DNA is in our family among all our ancestors. The Y chromosomal DNA follows that paternal lineage, so the father's line, and then the mitochondrial DNA follows that maternal lineage, the mother's line, all the way back. This slide here also shows a bit how DNA works in terms of inheritance, because when back in the 1800s, this guy named Gregor Mendel in Austria was looking at characteristics passed down through pea plants in this case. And he saw that if you would cross a purple-flowered pea plant with a white-flowered pea plant, that white-flowered characteristic would skip a generation and then show up in 1/4 of the next generation. The third generation would have that characteristic. So a light bulb went on in his head, and he said, somehow this characteristic of having a white flower gets masked in the second generation and gets re-expressed in the third generation. Somehow it is there in the second generation. He did not realize how it was there, but somehow he figured out that somehow that characteristic must be there. That is the exact same thing. This is DNA. He didn't know what DNA was yet at that time, but Gregor Mendel was beginning to figure out how DNA gets transmitted from generation to generation, and sometimes it's masked. And sometimes you see that in your families. Sometimes you have a characteristic of a grandmother or a grandfather or a great-grandmother or great-grandfather that skips a generation, or maybe skips 2 generations, and it shows up. It was there in that generation, just wasn't expressed. It was masked a bit. So here's an interesting question that comes up. Can DNA quantify ethnicity? Because these tests, especially those autosomal tests that we have today, they'll say something like, oh, you're 55% European and maybe 25% Middle Eastern, or maybe they'll be even more specific. They'll say 65% French and 30% Italian and such. So just be a little careful about what we mean by ethnicity and what we mean by quantifying ethnicity when it comes to this. Sure, there are markers that relate to certain regions of the world, but to say, oh, I have a test that's 47% French and you have a test that's 42% French, I must be more French than you, that's probably parsing it way too closely in terms of what DNA is actually telling us. And this idea of ethnicity, I'm going to say not exactly, because this idea of ethnicity, well, what is ethnicity exactly? The definition I have here is a community or group made up of people who share a common history, distinctive culture, and language. Note there's nothing about DNA there. Note you can be adopted into a group. We have that story of Rosanna of the Amish, right, who was born of Irish parents, and she was adopted very young into Amish culture and grew up in Amish culture. What would she consider her ethnicity in such a case? Maybe you have ancestors like this that were adopted, or maybe you have ancestors that were from parents that were part of two different cultures. I could imagine maybe French and German, and one of those cultures would have been emphasized maybe more than the other one in that family. So would you consider yourself French or German or a combination of that? Well, it kind of depends on what the family emphasized and such. You know, I have a friend from work who very obviously has Jewish ancestry, but it was his grandfather completely hid that ancestry when they came to New York, when they came to New York City. He lives in Boston now, but he only really discovered it later because of the war and such. So this idea of ethnicity doesn't always completely equate to our biological ancestry, right? Is biological ancestry different than ethnicity? Well, yeah, to some extent. Did your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents stress one tradition over another? Perhaps. Did it reflect your biological ancestry? Perhaps it did, or perhaps it didn't. Adoption's a big thing here, right? We all probably, if you go back far enough, have different ethnic groups in our ancestry. Ancestry tends to become more and more diverse as you go back through in time, but that then was adopted into another group. Your DNA is a scramble of your parents, just like I have color-coded here. Another thing that's interesting about these ethnic tests, you can have a brother, and I've seen this many times, and people ask me about it. You can have a brother and a sister that have slightly different percent ethnicities in their test, slightly different percents. Now, why would that be? They have exactly the same parents, exactly the same grandparents, exactly the same great-grandparents, brother and sister. Yet their tests come out, they don't come out really, really different. They come out slightly different. Maybe one is 35% French and the other one's 42% French or something like that. They come out a little different. And it doesn't make sense, does it? But your DNA is a scramble from your parents. It doesn't parse infinitely. It parses in segments. There are segments you get from dad, and those segments you get from dad are a little bit different than the segments that your brother or sister gets from dad. So the first child may have those segments from their parents. The second child may have the first segment the same from dad, as you can see there. The second segment comes from mom, but in child one, that segment comes from dad. That's why child one is different than child two. That's why they don't look the same. If they're identical twins, then they have exactly the same DNA and they will look the same. But if they're just brother and sister or two sisters, not identical twins, it's going to be like this. You're going to get different pieces of DNA from each of your parents that's going to be different, to some extent different, than your brother or sister. Child three could be this way. So that's why those percent ethnicities in those DNA tests are slightly different between brothers and sisters. And that's why I say don't rely on the exact percentages too much in terms of comparative. It's kind of a general way to look at where do your ancestors come from. Like I am like 78% Swiss German and a little bit of English and a little bit of French and a little bit of Irish and a little bit of Italian that's mixed in there. And probably most of you would have kind of a similar profile, right? Yeah. So your DNA is a scramble of your parents, and here, I have one child that's this percent Scandinavian and Mediterranean Isles, and another child different, and another child different. Well, that's just because you get these different pieces of your DNA from your parents in different ways. So your DNA is a composite of pieces of your ancestors, but not every piece is represented equally. And this leads to another question that people have. And maybe it's not as much of a question up here. When your ancestors came in the 1830s, were there Native Americans living here or no? There were, okay. Does anybody know if they have Native American ancestry? No one does, okay. Okay, that's interesting, because my test reveals Native American ancestry. Oh, let me take that back a little bit. I tested my grandmother before she passed away. She passed away in 2016. I tested her in 2013. And her test revealed Native American ancestry. But my test, it got diluted. And this relates to part of that, because what happens here, let's go back a little bit. My test shows no Native American ethnicity. What does that mean? Do I have no Native American ancestors? Well, not exactly. What can happen is DNA from a remote ancestor can be diluted out and not show up in a test. So it can be like this. You have that one Native American ancestor, but that DNA doesn't get down to you. It gets diluted out. The DNA does not parse infinitely. It parses in pieces. Back then, you have 512 ancestors, or back another generation, 1,024 ancestors. Back that far, you don't necessarily have DNA from every one of your ancestors, because some of it gets diluted out, just like this slide. But it could show up in your cousin, because maybe that little piece of DNA that was from a Native American ancestor shows up in a cousin. So it so happens in my case, it didn't show up in my test, but it showed up in my grandmother. And I have all my grandmother's ancestors, right? I have all my grandmother's ancestors. It just got diluted out. So I have a lot of people that ask me, I want to test my DNA to see if I have Native American ancestry. And I say, if it shows up in your DNA, then you know. If it doesn't show up, you don't necessarily not know. So it can prove it, but it's not going to disprove it, so to speak, because it can get diluted out. And especially that happens when you go back 8 or more generations. So for me, I have lots of colonial, and in fact, all of my ancestors were colonial PA ancestors, and there were Native Americans around. And you go back that far, I have 400 or so families that were immigrant families. Most of you have more recent ancestors from Europe in the 1800s. So you go back maybe 7 or 8 generations, would it be? 6 maybe? Or yeah. So maybe it's not as likely to have Native American ancestors in that case. But if you have immigrant ancestors that came from Europe in the early 1700s, then it's more likely. And I think in Lancaster County, most people do have Native American ancestors. Yeah, for whatever reason. Some of them married Native Americans and whatnot, right? But for me, I found this in my grandmother, and I think now I have traced exactly where it comes from. My wife also has it, and she has it a little stronger than me. She might have 2 ancestors back that far that are Native American. So this is another thing. If you say my DNA is easy to explain and boring, I've had people say this. All my ancestors were from the same ethnic group. That just means you have to look a little closer. Because as you go back in time, DNA, or not just DNA, but as you go back in time, ancestry becomes more and more diverse. You have more and more families represented. There's going to be more and more stories and richer stories as you go back in time. I got about 400 immigrant ancestors. Well, each of those has a story, has a particular story. And some of those stories are very vivid and striking. Sometimes there are men that died on the voyage or preparing for the voyage, and the women come over with their children. The women, as a widow, come over with their children to try to start a family in the New World. Some of those stories are such that there were in 1717, there were 3 ships that departed from Rotterdam containing Swiss Mennonites. They came to Lancaster County. Families purposely, by choice, divided up their families on these 3 ships, that some went on the one ship and some on the other and some on the other, in case one of those ships didn't make it, or in case 2 of those ships didn't make it, at least some of the family would make it. They divided up those families that way because they were afraid. It wasn't necessarily that safe to travel across the ocean by boat at that time. There were pirates, there were storms, there were stories of boats that never arrived, and 300 people on a ship just vanished at sea. So families chose to split up their families so that if one boat was never found again, at least some of their family would survive. That's really something, right? You hear these stories like this. And the thing is, those 3 ships, they did separate out in the middle of the ocean. And the one arrived in early August, and the next one it took another week to arrive, and the last one it took to August 24 to arrive. So you didn't know until that next ship arrived. Stories like that are quite awesome to think about. And 400, and maybe you have 200 or 100 immigrant ancestors. They all have unique stories like that. This becomes very rich and diverse. Okay, on to the project. I have my project that I set up is called Mennonite and Amish Immigrants DNA Project. You can find it on the web through that address, through Family Tree DNA. There's also a parallel Swiss Anabaptist DNA project that's on there as well. I list both those out. These are both Y-DNA projects. They look at the Y-DNA. The purpose here to determine specific DNA signatures, Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, emphasizing the families of the 17th and 18th century, Mennonite and Amish families that came to Pennsylvania, some of whom later immigrated west across the United States and Canada. These families were predominantly of Swiss, German, and Dutch origin. I'll include the New York families in there. If you want to test through my project, no problem. You can test through this project. Even though it says Pennsylvania, a lot of the surnames match and are the same. And you'll find interesting information here. These signatures, these Y-DNA signatures, can then be used to enhance family history, to better determine the lineages of unidentified families, to link families together who were otherwise not considered linked. We'll talk about a little bit of that here, to determine which families relate more closely in cluster groups, and to assess and categorize genetic diversity among Swiss, German, and Dutch families. So some of the things that we can determine like this is this family Souder. You see how it has all these names spelled. Some of these names are represented in Lancaster County, particularly the S-O-U-D-E-R and S-A-U-D-E-R. Well, if they have the same Y chromosome, Y-DNA signature, then we know they're the same family in Europe. And we've had a lot of different people test in these families, and we can see here that this tester through immigrant Jacob Souder has this group on the end, an RBY group there. The Jacob Souder, which was another immigrant, has a different group. He's not a match. So 2 Souders are not the same family. But this other one down at the bottom, this Casper Souder, is part of the same group as the Jacob Souder. So we can begin to organize these families in clusters. Even though in this case they have the same surname, they're not all the same family. The one Souder immigrant is of a different family than the others. Now, the reason for this would be, we could go back to the origin of the name. Souder is a suitor. would be how the name would have been originally, and it's a person who works with leather and sews leather. It's an occupational name. When you have an occupational name, it's more likely that people that are not necessarily related would take on that surname. And here we have a case of that. Even though 3 of these immigrants are Mennonites, and all 3 are really from generally the same community, the same region, all are Swiss, all moved to southern Germany and then came over to Pennsylvania in the early 1700s. But only 2 of the 3 are of the same family and the other one's of a separate family. You really can only determine this through DNA. There's not a paper record that's going to tell you that these families are different. You can only determine it through DNA. It gets a little more complex when you look at a family like, these are just some slides that show how that family is listed on the Souter DNA project. If it gets a little more complicated when you take a family like Zimmerman. What does Zimmerman mean in English? Anyone? What does Zimmer mean? It's a German word, Zimmer. Zimmer is a room made of wood. So a Zimmerman is literally a builder of rooms, which would be a carpenter, right? So we have this name Zimmerman in Lancaster County, and we have the name Carpenter in Lancaster County, and we have some Zimmermans and some Carpenters that are part of the same DNA group, and we have Zimmermans that are part of different DNA groups, and we have Carpenters that are part of different DNA groups, and we have Swiss Zimmermans and Swiss Carpenters, and we have English Carpenters, and we have Zimmermans that never changed their name to Carpenter, and we have some Zimmermans that changed their name to Carpenter. So it gets very complex, but the way that you can sort it out is through DNA. And this Carpenter's Cousins DNA project did that. And there are, I listed here 28 groups, and there are even more than that. And that group number 5, the Zimmermans from Steffensburg, Switzerland, are the Mennonite Zimmermans. And there's another group of Mennonite Zimmermans in Lancaster County that are that group number 9, that Bern Swiss-American Zimmerman line. Those 2 groups are represented in Lancaster County. You might not have this name here. Do you have this name here, Zimmerman? You don't have this name here. But you can see how this relates. There are all these groups that have names Zimmerman and Carpenter. Some of them are related through their surname, and some of them aren't. We also have this name Wanger that can be spelled all these different ways. And back in Switzerland, it's Wanger with the V sound instead of the W. Wanger. And then we found that this person in South Carolina has a surname Vineyard and matches the DNA signature of the Wanger family. So it's a phonetic. We never would have realized this without DNA, but it's phonetic. You know, the name was pronounced Wanger, and apparently this immigrant to South Carolina in the early 1800s, Ishmael Wanger, made his name anglicized to Vineyard. And they always knew their name to be Vineyard. They test their DNA, and they match the Wangers. So phonetically, those names are together. I would not have known that before DNA. I would not have known that Wanger and Vineyard are the same family, but the DNA is showing us that there. It's kind of a new discovery through DNA. By the way, that Fort Wanger that's there, that is in the Alsace, Lorraine area in the town of Raquil. I was there in the summer of 2022. That was a Swiss family that moved to the Alsace as well. There's just a chart that shows those Wangers listed on the project. This name here, Hostetter, Hostetler, and all these different derivatives. We have these forms that have tested and match a certain signature, but then there's also a name Hostetter without the L-E-R, just has E-L, or just has E-R at the end, and it's a different signature. So in this case, we know that Hostetter and Hostetler are different surnames. You would kind of think that maybe those are the same surname, but here the Y DNA is telling us they're different surnames. This one you have, right? Knopfsinger. You have that family here, right? All right, we have an established Y DNA signature on the project for the Knopfsingers. Right there it is. It's a G signature. It would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it, that, do your Knopfsingers here, you spelled it a little different there, right? Or maybe pronounce it different. You pronounce it different. Yeah. I mean, is it the same signature or not? That would be kind of an interesting thing to see, right? We have the signature here in Lancaster County that goes back, I think, to the Alsace region. It's an Amish family. Does it match yours? I would assume so. Mennonites, Amish, same region. We could determine that by testing. Troyer as well here. Maybe you don't have that family, Troyer. That's also an Amish family. Ohio, Iowa, areas out west. This is the Zimmerman, Yoder, and Martin clusters that are on the project. This one, Nistley, you can see here this name is spelled different ways. Sometimes it's spelled with the KN. Sometimes it's spelled without the N. There's two different signatures, and it seems like they match pretty well, that the one signature is the KN spelling of the family, and the other signature is without the K, even though the pronunciations between the two families are the same. We have Gingrichs in the project. Sometimes they spell their name with a K, a Kingrich and Kingri, and sometimes it's with a G, and they're the same signature. So that means they came from the same family, just the spellings changed over time. Hershey, you have that here, right? We have one Hershey DNA signature in Lancaster County. This is the one. It's the R group that's mentioned here. You spell it different than we do, though, right? Or no? With an I at the end? Pronounce Hershey there, or Hershey? Pronounce Hershey? 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 Okay. It would be interesting to see if your Hersheys that come from the 1800s from Alsace, 1830s, right, or so, are the same family as the Hersheys in Lancaster County that came in 1717. The Hersheys came on those ships that I was talking about earlier, those 3 ships, divided up the family. Be interesting to know. Kaufman. There are Kaufmans that are Mennonite, and there are Kaufmans that are Amish, and we figured out through Y-DNA signatures that the Kaufmans that are Amish are a different family of Kaufmans than the Kaufmans that are Mennonite. They don't go back to the same Kaufmans. They're different families. And there's a third family of Kaufmans in there, too. This is an interesting one, and with this one I'm going to close. It's after 3, isn't it? Let's see, it's after 3. I'm going to close with this one, but it's interesting for you, particularly. So I have this family in Lancaster County, Her, which I have listed up here. We have a well-established DNA signature for it. Now, in Switzerland, this would have been, or in Germany, this would have been Herr, this sound. Hair is how that would have been pronounced, supposedly. Now, Hans-Peter Jecker over in Switzerland, he's a Swiss historian, Mennonite historian. He found where this family comes from in this town called Blumenstein, south of Bern. It's close to where the Martins come from, so I'm pretty familiar with this region. But we didn't know this for a long time. It's only about 2 or 3 years ago that he figured this out, and he wrote a report about it, because the spellings with the name had sometimes an S and sometimes a Z at the beginning of the spelling. So it has a little bit of a Latin influence. Like when I talk about Spain in Latin or in Spanish, I say España. Or even this word Hispanic has this sound at the beginning of it, and sometimes that gets reversed. So sometimes there's the H is not really a consonant. It's more like a puff of air, hair. right? So sometimes if you say hair and you say there, they're very close. You don't move your mouth too much when you say these names. So having the name hair, and he found the records with the name with the S and with the Z in front that relate to her family. We would say in English her, but it would be hair or zer. You have a family here that has this name zer, and we think now that this name zer is the same as the name hair. Now, how are we going to determine that for sure? And the reason we think that is because these records that Hans-Peter Jecker found have the her ancestors in Blumenstein sometimes spelling their name with the Z or the S in front, so it's like there, right? So how are we going to determine if the Z-E-H-R is the same family as the H-E-R-R? That's the only homework question I have for you at the end. It's going to be through the DNA, right? And we have an established signature here for the Her family in Lancaster County. Now, I did find somebody named Zer that got tested, and he doesn't match. So I don't want to get our hopes up too much. But I don't know. I still think this sounds really right. And I would certainly hope that we could have some Zers test to see if they match the hers. You know, in English, these names differentiated, but you go back and her, zer, it's the same. I think it's the same name. But we would prove it with DNA if we would have a tester, right? And with that, I am going to close and allow some questions, I guess. What time do we have? Look here and see. It's up there, right? It's 3:15 or so, right? I can allow 5-10 minutes for some questions and such, and then we'll close. Anything? There was a question up here, and I didn't respond. Correct.
But you're male.
Correct.
The female.
Yes.
It's female. So is that why your grandmother has it?
It is not on the Y chromosome, this Native American marker in my family. It is in the autosomal DNA. The autosomal DNA is the DNA that you get from all different ancestors, right? So it so happens it's in my grandmother's test. I only would know of this because my grandmother tested, because in me it got diluted out. My grandmother was alive. I had her test. It shows up very small, 0.1%. So it's back at least 8 generations from her, or 7 or 8 generations from her, certainly 9 or 10 generations from me, right? Two more generations removed. Possibly, because sometimes those markers come through that way. My sister has not tested yet. My aunt has tested, and it does show up in her. My aunt has tested. I have not pressured my sister to test. I mean, maybe she will at some point, who knows? But it's like, who is interested in your family in this, and have them test. And it was my aunt. Like, I talked about this. I have many cousins and such, and I talked about this. And my aunt expressed interest in testing. And she has the marker. Yeah. And I have pretty well parsed where in my grandmother's ancestry it comes from, because I looked at other matches that have this marker, and I found in those other matches where we have a common ancestor. So I can isolate the family that this comes from. And it's, again, you can't quite connect it to a surname, right? But the Heatwall, there's an immigrant, Jacob Heatwall, that comes to Lancaster County as a single man. There's some evidence that maybe his wife and his earlier kids had all died in the village, and he was on the voyage, and he was the only survivor. And he comes and he marries a woman that is a sister to this Christian Hawes. We don't have her first name. And this Christian Hawes his father and mother, it looks like the mother was Native American. That's what it looks like, yeah. So I can kind of trace it that way. So probably from where they lived, it would have been a Lenape, a Native American Lenape person, a Delaware Indian, yeah. Mhm. Any other questions? Yes?
You talked about physical similarities
Mm-hmm.
being inherited. What about talents? Like, say a man has a carpentry talent.
Mm-hmm.
Is anything like that testable? Or somebody said it wasn't taught up to even know carpentry.
And he learns it.
Yet they have a very strong talent toward it.
Sure, there's connections, but is it testable? I mean, these kinds of things have more nuance. It's not just like one gene or one marker in one's DNA that would showcase something like that. It'd be a combination of markers that are working together in different ways. That
Identifying traits of my aunts, uncles, parents, grandparents,
Yeah.
and grandchildren. And
Yeah, exactly. You can identify those. But the knack about doing well in carpentry, it has to do with good spatial recognition, having good eyesight, having good dexterity in the hands, right? So there's all these kinds of different, it's not just about carpentry, it's about, well, if that person's good at that, they're probably good at a few other things that are related to using the hands and spatial concepts and such as well, right? Yeah. But a lot of it is just being an apprentice and learning it from family too. Yeah, not everything you can figure out by DNA. That raises a good point, but DNA is often used in combination with, what we get genetically from our parents, let's say, is used in combination with our experience and what we're taught and how we grow up to make us who we are, right? Anyone else? Yes? Yes, so both these projects that I mentioned, the Mennonite and Amish Immigrants DNA Project and the Swiss Anabaptist DNA Project, are through Family Tree DNA. There are 3 companies that are the primary companies. There are more than that, but 3 that are the primary ones that deal with this testing. Ancestry.com or Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, and 23andMe. I've tested through all 3 of those. They all have a bit of their own emphases. They all operate in their own separate databases. So when you look at matches to your test, if you test with Family Tree DNA, you're not going to have the Ancestry matches on there, the Ancestry DNA matches. You're going to have just the matches in the tests that you take. So if you get into this more deeply, then you want to test through all the companies to try to figure out as much as you can, which is what I did. But those are the 3 general popular ones. There are other ones that people use too. Yeah. Okay, we'll close with that.